Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on leadership communication, getting your voice heard. My name is Hannah Jansen, and I'm the marketing manager here at Bluepoint. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, this webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive a copy of the recording. Secondly, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A panel. Finally, if you have any questions after the webinar, please email us at info@bluepointleadership.com or call us at 888-221-8685. All right, I'm going to pass things over to Joan Peterson, Vice President of Bluepoint.
Thanks, Hannah, and welcome everyone. So excited to be able to spend some time with you talking about this idea of leadership communication. My name is Joan Peterson, and again, the topic for today is getting our voices heard. I'd like to start by sharing a story with you. It's a story about a gentleman named Muhammad Yunus. I don't know if folks are familiar with the name Muhammad Yunus, but he won the Nobel Prize a number of years back. And when he was younger, many years before he won the Nobel Prize, he was an economics professor in Bangladesh. And he was teaching economics at the time of a great famine inside Bangladesh. And he saw that sort of the correlation between what he was doing and this great famine that was happening right outside the doors of the school. Like he just couldn't make that work for himself. So he actually took some of his students and he went out into one of the neighboring towns of the school where he was teaching. And he met with some of the families. And he talks about the first family he met. He spoke with a woman named Sophia. And he said, if you could picture Sophia, she lived in like a thatched hut, mud floors. She was a basket weaver, really talented basket weaver. And she barely made enough money with her craft, really good at it, to feed her family. So he said they interviewed Sophia and women like Sophia, really asking them what it was like and what were some of the things that were keeping them from making more money in order to be able to better take care of themselves and their families. And he said that part of what Sophia explained was that in order for her to make the baskets and stools that she made, she had to borrow money in order to buy the bamboo to make these products. And the price of the bamboo changed. Basically, it went up if she made more, and it went down if she made less. So she made pennies a day, regardless of what she produced or what she sold. And they asked Sophia and the other families that they interviewed, like, how much would it take dollars to pull you out of the moneylender's grasp? And they went out and they talked to 40 plus, mostly women, and asked that same question: how much money would it take to pull you out of the grasp of those moneylenders? They went back into the school, 40 plus families, and they counted up how much in US dollars it would take to pull them out of that poverty. And how much do you think it was? 27 US dollars. So he said, what do you think we did? Like, we reached into our pockets and we were able to help those 40 plus families. And he said, but that wasn't enough. There were so many who were in Sophia's shoes. So what he did was he went out and basically told Sophia's story. And he was the father of the microcredit industry. He founded the Grameen Bank, and that's really the place where he earned the Nobel Prize. And he talked about the fact that if he had put together a really slick slide deck, right, and kind of had cool slides about to whom he wanted to lend money and how much they had to collateral they had, he said, I would have gotten no one supporting me, because basically I wanted support for women when most of, in that part of the world, and at that time, most of the banks were lending to men. I wanted to lend them small amounts of money. Again, most of the banks were interested in lending large amounts of money. And I wanted to lend small amounts of money to women with no collateral. He said, I would have gotten no help. Instead, he said, when I went out and told Sophia's story, not only did people applaud the efforts, but they opened their pocketbooks. So I share that story with you because I believe getting our voice heard, there's certain things that we can do to get our voice heard in a way a lot like Muhammad Yunus did, not by putting together a really slick slide deck, but by thinking through what's the key message that I want to deliver it and how can I deliver it in the most impactful way. I also believe that one of the things Muhammad Yunus knew was that I don't just get the message across by putting together a presentation. I get the message across by being me, by being authentically me, and by tapping into the emotions of others, my own passion and the emotions of others. I do think inside organizations, especially now, it's really difficult to get our voices heard. And it's like, gosh, well, why is it so difficult? And when we think about organizations, I think our traditional sense of organizations is, this reporting structure where we come into an office and I have a boss and I have a team and I have colleagues and I know exactly the structure of where I'm working. We all know that organizations don't look like this, especially now. you know we have hybrid teams, we have remote teams, we have dotted line relationships, we have matrix organizations. So we don't any longer need to get our message across in organizations that look like that. We need to get our messages across in organizations that look like this. This is what we're up against. Organizations are a bit noisy, they're chaotic, they're alignment challenges, and people competing for resources, even in the same teams. So when we think about getting our voice heard, it's so difficult because this, again, is what we're competing against. So what we hear from many leaders inside organizations during times of change, during times of ambiguity, basically now is, well, more communication is better. I don't think more communication is better. I think better communication is better. And really, that's what we'll talk about here. I have two daughters, and one of my daughters, she's now 15, but when she was little, and this is a picture of her when she was little, she would say, if I don't get my voice heard, I just turn my talk up. I remember saying to her, how's that working for you? And I think inside organizations, we turn our talk up. We say it again. We say it more loud. We say it, send out another email. It's like, I don't think people stop us and say, well, how's that working for you? There are things, though, that we can do to get our voices heard. And part of it is recognizing what we're up against. We are up against so many different things as to why our voices don't get heard. We speak at this rate, we listen a bit quicker than we can speak, but we think at this rate. So that means when we're trying to communicate with someone else, we're really up against all the thoughts in their head. And here's the other thing. Oftentimes when we're speaking to someone on Zoom, we're speaking to someone in a live meeting, we see them doing this. And we all assume that they agree and they understand. And really, what does this mean when somebody's doing the head bob? It means that I was kind of taught to do this as a child, and I kind of nod my head to show I'm listening, and I could be doing 100 other things in my head. So this kind of the head bob means absolutely nothing. We need to recognize that there are tremendous distractions amongst everyone, ourselves included. And the biggest challenge with communication is the illusion that has taken place. Just because you sent the email, just because you had the conversation, just because you mentioned it in a meeting, doesn't mean that people heard, and it doesn't mean that they understood. In fact, there was a piece of research that was done. It was in the book Made to Stick. The authors talked about this research that was done out in Stanford. A woman took, the researcher took pairs of people into a room, and she said, okay, person A, you're going to be the tapper. Person B, you're going to be the listener. And she would say to the tapper, I'm going to give you a song to tap. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, happy birthday to you. And the listener, you're just going to listen to the taps and don't say anything. And then the tapper would tap the song, and she'd say to the tapper, I'm going to bring in 250 pairs of people today. How many, and she'd say this to the tapper, how many listeners do you think will guess the song? And the tappers guessed like a really large percentage. And then she would say to the listener, okay, what song did they just tap? And fewer than 5% guessed the song. And she said the look of disdain on the tappers' faces, like, you've never heard of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, like happy birthday to you, not a song that you heard as a child. And but if you think about what happened there, what are you doing when you're tapping the song? You're singing it in your head. So her thesis was that happens inside organizations all day long. And that when we communicate, we have a especially as leaders, we have a pretty significant songbook. And oftentimes we're communicating to different people, and each person has a different songbook. And sometimes our songs are not in their book. So they do this, they nod their head, we deliver the message, they have a different songbook, and they take it in a completely different way than we intended. They don't hear it, they jump to conclusions. Oftentimes that's how rumors get started inside organizations. So I think as leaders, the first step is recognizing, not just as leaders, as any human being inside a community, inside an organization, recognizing the biggest problem is the illusion that has taken place. I really need to be intentional about important messages that I want to send out. I also need to know that I'm competing against neurology, right? So people are thinking at a much quicker rate than I'm speaking, which means that their hands are on this remote control and they can press the mute button. And quite frankly, they do every so often. What we're trying to do is keep their hands off that off button. And there are ways that we can do this. Again, from a neurological perspective, there are things that we can do to capture the minds and the hearts of others when we communicate. 4 key ideas that our belief is will help you to get your voice heard. Keep that hand off the mute and the off button more times than not. And the 4 key pieces of information that we'll talk about today. The first is around trust, foundation of trust. The second is around making a personal connection. The third is around content. And what are some of the tools or power tools for sharing content in a way that people can remember? And the fourth is the power of the story. So if we start with this idea of trust, now, if you have a presentation to give, and you have a room of 100, 1,000, 10 people, I believe we should first be thinking about, okay, what's the level of trust when I get in front of the room? Do they trust me? And if not, what am I going to do right out of the blocks to generate trust? One-on-one relationships. How can we really be intentional about building that foundation of trust, one conversation at a time? And I think it starts with this question, even thinking for ourselves, what does it take to earn our trust? So what does it take for someone to earn your trust? And I've asked this question of, thousands of leaders. I was just with a group this past week and I asked this question. Probably the number one response I get is, what earns my trust is when the person who's sitting across from me or standing in front of me in a large room is authentic. And I love this. I think authenticity is the alignment of the head, the heart, the feet, saying, thinking, doing, everything consistently. This builds trust, and followers love leaders they can trust. I think if we listen to people we can trust. So I share this because I think, again, an audience of 1 or an audience of 1,000, what do they see as your level of authenticity? I think we can build that really quickly in a new group. And I think we need to be intentional about keeping it with a group we work with every day. So if we look at this idea of authenticity, oftentimes it comes from, what do you stand for? And do people recognize what you stand for? And are you consistent with that? So one of the things we did, and when we built this workshop, we have a workshop on leadership communication, is we looked at different people in all different industries and what are the things they talk about. So we pulled this quote out. Of course, this is from the music industry. This individual said, as a rock star, I have 2 instincts. I want to have fun. I want to change the world. I have a chance to do both. And part of the question I'll ask you is, if you just saw that quote, like, what do you think authenticity is for that leader, for that rock star? It's around having fun. It's around altruism. That this is what this person talks about. They also talk about, if you look at quotes from this particular musician, they talk about this idea of diversity and unification, to respect the right to be different as maybe even greater. So what I think is interesting is, oftentimes when we share this with the leaders we work with, and we talk about, okay, what do you think this rock star stands for? And people talk about diversity and yeah, I'm having fun and altruism and wanting to make a difference. And then I'll ask this question, like, who do you think said both of these things? And quite often, many people will guess, yeah, I absolutely knew that's what he stands for. That's what he talks about. And then if you look at this one, again, another leader, a lot of companies have chosen to downsize. That maybe that was the right thing for them. We've chosen a different path. Our belief was that if we were putting great products in front of customers, they would continue to open their wallets. And I'll ask leaders, like, what do you think that leader stands for? And part of what I hear is innovation, commerce. Kind of that commerce is a value, it's a principle. And then the same leader said this: innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Of course, innovation at the heart of this leader. And again, I'll ask leaders that we work with, who do you think said both of these? And quite often, many people will guess at that Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, when Steve Jobs talked, he talked about innovation, he talked about commerce. And that's kind of what he stood for. One more. I wanted to do God's will, and he allowed me to go to the mountains and look over. And he said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And also said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are not judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. And again, individuals will talk about, the higher power and diversity being true core beliefs, core values, of course, of Martin Luther King Jr. And I think the challenge for us is to say, okay, like pretty clear what these individuals, all different walks of life, stood for and what they talked about and what their convictions were. What if I gathered together those people that you work with every day? What quote would they attribute to you? What would they say authentic you looks like? That's how we start to build trust, by making sure that what we say and what we do matches. But people know what our core is and what's most important to us. I'm going to ask you to take just a moment and take a look at the words on the screen here. And if you had to choose 5 of these, what would you say are the 5 things that stand at your core? What's most important to you? And maybe it's something that's not on the screen at all. But I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about your own core beliefs, your own core values. And that's the basis for who we are as humans. And recognizing that the person sitting next to us likely stands for different things. I think it's then challenging ourselves to say, do I show up doing that every day? Would others recognize what consistency looks like for me? What do I talk about? Another way to look at this, ancient Rome status symbol was to get a statue built of ourselves, right? So became really popular to have a statue made instead of having a cool car or a nice home. And as demand for these statues went up, as the demand for the sculptures went up, of course, more sculptors started showing up, and some were more talented or gifted than others. And those sculptors, those artists who weren't as talented, legend has it that they used wax to kind of cover up some of their mistakes. So if I was kind of sculpting Hannah, if I was sculpting a bust of Hannah and I chipped off a piece of her nose, I would take a little wax and I would kind of reattach the piece. Or if I was working with material that wasn't as fine, I would use the wax to provide a shine or a sheen. And think about it, these statues were really put outside, and in the hot sun, you could tell after a while which ones had wax. So those artists who worked without wax would put a sign on their door that said this in Sarah, translates to without wax. Of course, our word sincerity comes from the practice of working without wax. So my encouragement to you is to think about, if you were going to put a sign on your door, what would it say? What would you want people to say about you? What would you want them to know about sort of that your authentic you was, so that they could look at what you do every day as consistent? Really, this is around understanding what our high road is. What are our ethical boundaries, our core principles, important behaviors? And as humans, as leaders, I think it's important for us to recognize what that is for ourselves, and then to be really thoughtful about how does that show up for others. Love this, decide what to stand for, then stand for it all the time. That's how we build trust. Do people see us as being consistent? And are we intentional about it? The second key thought is around personal connection. And I think critically important in communication is to make a connection with the person with whom we're communicating. obviously. And again, if it's 1,000 people, it's how do I connect with those 1,000 people? If it's one person, how do I connect with that one person? If it's an email, how do I connect with that person? And we look at connection from three different perspectives. The first, I think, is an interesting one. I think we connect with people when we speak about something that's important to us. So when somebody is passionate about something, we see actually people leaning in to listen to them. We do an exercise in one of our workshops where we line people up, and half the group at the same time, they each have a partner, they have 90 seconds to talk about something that they're passionate about. So the energy and the noise level goes way up inside the room, and their partner actually leans in to listen to them. And part of what we ask them is, how often do you think people lean in to listen to you at work? I mean, it's unfortunately not that often. So part of our belief is that if we're delivering a message that's ours, it makes it easy for us to connect to something that we're passionate about. Sometimes if we're delivering a message that's someone else's, it comes across that way. And quite often people won't listen to us. So before we deliver a message, we need to really be thinking about, okay, what part of this message connects with me? And how can I represent it in a way that shows that I'm interested, engaged, and passionate about it? The other piece around this is, I think, showing up as energized and passionate comes naturally to some, and it doesn't come naturally to others. And it's being able to recognize what this isn't about, putting on a sort of a fake, oh, let me kind of get excited about this. It is about recognizing how I'm impacting others. Do I need to really think about, what does me connecting to a message look like to other people? And how might I, again, be intentional about how I'm showing up and the impact that I have? The other, so that's the first lens of personal connection. The second lens of personal connection, and this is the one that I think we all think about naturally, is connecting to what's important to the audience. Again, audience of one, getting in their shoes. How does this connect to them from a personal level? Audience of 1,000, getting in their shoes. How do I connect with each person in this audience? What's in it for them? And again, I think many of us, when we're delivering a message, we put ourselves in their shoes. But it's being really intentional about this idea of connecting with them. When we're delivering a message, people are especially if it's a corporate message, people are listening. Yes, they want to know the organization news, but really what they want to know is how the organization news impacts them. So as a leader, when I'm delivering a message, I need to really put myself in their shoes and recognize what's important to them. And it comes down to this idea of empathy. I mean, everything we talk about from a leadership perspective, empathy is part of it. People want to be heard, especially during times of change and ambiguity, especially when there's hybrid and remote workforces. And are we able to hear others? Some key practices associated with empathetic listening to help us know what it's like to be in their shoes. The first one is around getting present with others. Really hard. So many things competing for our attention. And people know when we're present, and they know when we're not. And when we're not present, our authenticity, our credibility takes a hit. You can't truly listen to anyone and do anything else at the same time. The minute we think we can multitask, we can't. The minute we look at that text message, we've shut everyone else down, and we've sent a message to them that other things are more important. So that, I think, really hard and key to connecting with others. Become curious. Seek to explore and learn about the person, about what they do, about who they are, so that you can see things from their perspective. In a conversation, part of empathetic listening is welcoming silence. It's giving people time and space. One of the participants that I worked with a number of years back said, "Oh, my boss gave me feedback that I wasn't a very good listener." And he said, "Here's a tip. Every so often, ask yourself, am I listening or am I waiting to talk?" Once we're waiting to talk, we've stopped listening. So it's welcoming silence, making it okay, and really difficult especially in a virtual conversation, to welcome silence. But again, it's being intentional, giving the other person time and space, and trying on their shoes. What's it like to be them? Who are they? How do I know what this will look like and feel like from their perspective? The third lens of personal connection is connecting to what's important to the organization. So it's how does this serve the organization in some way? Here's what I've seen, and here's what I believe, that most of us, when we're crafting a message where we're looking to get influence, we start with this one. Let me tell you why this is important to the organization, or let me tell you why we should do this from a budgetary perspective. What we believe is that this is important. We need to have it. I think it's important to share facts and ROI, and absolutely we need to have it. But really, we first need to connect with the other person, that second lens, and we need to bring ourselves to the conversation. We need to know how this is personally important to us and show this as well. I think sometimes we show this and we don't really look to the other two ways to connect with others. The third key idea is around content, and I'd like to look at it, light touch on three areas: sharing facts, using imagery, and thinking about what language we use. Facts, I think, is interesting that people love facts, and I think facts are extremely important. We do need to show the logic and the analytics behind what we're doing. But I do think sometimes we bore people to tears with how we share the facts. And I love the slide. The facts may not be boring, but you might be. There are ways that we can share facts that people both enjoy, understand, and remember. So how can you make the facts that you have memorable to the other person? So one of the questions that I quite often will ask groups of folks is, how big is an acre of land? And sometimes you have somebody who knows exactly how many square feet an acre of land is. I do not. And then I say, like, can you picture how big an acre of land is? And people kind of say, yeah, I can sort of picture how big an acre of land is. And here's another way to look at how big an acre of land is. What if I were to tell you that an acre of land is about the size of an American football field without the end zones? Like, now I can really picture how big an acre of land is. And the next time somebody asks me how big is an acre of land, I probably will say, about the size of an American football field without the end zones, instead of having to remember the specific facts. So are we able to create an image of facts, put them into a story, help people to remember them differently? And that brings us to the second tool, is around using imagery. And this doesn't come from, oh gosh, I need to share them a really cute picture. This comes from neuroscience. To think in images is a choice we make. We don't use imagery to enliven communication, but what imagery helps us to do is to convey significant messages. It helps us to attach emotion, and it's what our brain remembers. Our brain remembers imagery, metaphor, and story. Walt Disney said, of all of our inventions for mass communication, pictures still speak the most universally understood language. I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And pictures, images convey real meaning. So picture this. Let's say we're in a room, 25 people. And I've done this exercise with leaders, hand out images to each of them. So they all have a different image. And then one by one, people introduce themselves and they hold up the image they have. And they talk about, well, this image, how this image metaphorically represents their role inside the organization. Hi, I'm Joan Peterson, and here's how this image metaphorically represents my role inside the organization. And they've had 30 seconds to come up with it. So you go around the room, 25 people. And then I will go back around the room and I'd pick maybe 5 or 6 people. Do you remember what Hannah said? Do you remember what Brian said? Do you remember what Mary said? And what we find is that we remember 90 to 95% of the images and what people said about what their role is. And here's the interesting thing. If you do standard introductions in a workshop, 25 people, the likelihood is you will remember next to nothing. Because when people are, before they go, when I'm not going, think about what you're doing. If you do standard introductions, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say while everyone else is going. And then after I've gone, I'm thinking about what I should have said. So we need to be thoughtful about when we actually do this exercise for introductions, people remember it. It conveys meaning. I did this exercise just this past week, and one of the gentlemen said he was taking the image and he was hanging it up because people kept coming back to it for him. And it helps us connect in a different kind of a way. It uses a different part of our brain. Another tool for communication, of course, is language, and it's being thoughtful about the type of language we choose to use. There's huge power in the words we choose to use. Mark Twain said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. Huge difference. Our founder was at a board meeting, and he said they were talking about a really tough point, and they were arguing it back and forth. And one of the gentlemen was kind of sitting back and didn't say much. And when it came time for him to speak, he said this: "If we do this, I fear that it will leave, if we do this, I feel that it will leave a stain on our legacy that we will never wash off." And everyone was silent. I mean, think about the power of language. And how do you think they decided? Do we use language in a way that people stop and listen? Or do we just turn our talk up? Um, Interesting article. This came out a number of years back. So this is a few years old in Inc. magazine. There's an article about who writes this stuff and who notices. And they looked at language used on websites. And they looked at what do organizations on their websites, when they say we provide, like what language do they use? So one of the ones that they looked up is how many companies say this: "We provide full service solutions." Yep, if you use that, you are in good company. 40,000 other companies use that. So not really differentiating yourself. What about this? "We provide cost effective end-to-end solutions." Again, in really good company, not really differentiating. What about this one? "We provide value added services." Yep, lots of companies. So it's what language do you choose to use? And they talk about this one company that said, well, what we provide is a bag they will fight over when you die. So it's a company called Saddleback Leather, and they're obviously a leather bag company. And if you look at this is their warranty. Their website's pretty cool. I haven't looked at it in a while, but this is from their website. Around the warranty, it says all of our products are fully warranted against all defects in materials and workmanship for 100 years. If you have a problem, send it back to me or one of my descendants, and we'll repair or replace it for free. Be sure to mention the warranty in your will. They'll fight over it when you're dead. I mean, think about that. Like, what language do we use? So when we were looking at language, and we were looking at this company, the founder of our company actually bought one of these. So he's a proud owner of one of the Saddleback bags. They're beautiful. And I would travel with him a lot, and I'd say, like, I where's your bag? I haven't seen it. And he said, "It's in my closet. They're going to fight over it when I'm dead." It's just a huge power around the kind of language that we use. Mark Twain said, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." I think sometimes in organizations, when we don't put time and thought into delivering our message, we deliver a long message instead. And more communication isn't necessarily better communication. So the question really is around language: is what language are you choosing to use? Inside many organizations, there are words that hold power, and there are words that we overuse. So it's even being thoughtful about what words am I using? Is this something that's overused? That's going to people are going to press the mute button when they hear it. The last piece, the last key idea is around this idea of story. There's huge power in story inside organizations. I think it's how our brain works. It's how we remember information. Steve Jobs said the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. Sets the vision, values, agenda of an entire generation to come. Now, Steve Jobs, lots of things he did, I wouldn't say I would put him in world-class leader. But what he was good at was this idea of storytelling, of helping to understand what the vision was about. We talked about before, innovation and commerce, and combining those things together. And he learned from experience. I don't know if folks remember, one of the products that came out early was the Lisa. It was a machine that they thought would change the world. And their first marketing piece for the Lisa was 8 or 9 pages of basically words about how this will change your life. And they didn't sell many of them. In fact, it was a huge disappointment. They lost huge amounts of money on this machine called the Lisa. And really what they learned is, this marketing campaign with words isn't going to help us. And the next big advertising campaign that came out was the Think Different campaign. If you haven't seen it, gosh, it's pretty, goes back a number of years. It's fabulous. I mean, and it is about this idea of storytelling and getting your message across. And not once did we see a picture of the Lisa or any other product, but it was about thinking different. And that became the mantra, the slogan, the logo of that whole generation to come in terms of how they looked at selling their products. This gentleman, I don't know if folks are familiar with this gentleman, his name is Brian Stevenson. And he gave a TED talk a number of years ago, and it was at the time the longest standing ovation in TED Talk history. And it was on the injustice in the legal system around poverty and how the poor don't get an equal shot. And he has a nonprofit that really is about serving those who are poor and can't help themselves in the legal system. And a fabulous TED talk. And yes, it's great. He got a standing ovation. And what happened next was even more powerful. What happened next was people called the TED organization to see how they could donate to his nonprofit. They raised he not once did he ask for any money. What he did was he touched hearts and minds by talking about the people that he was serving. And what he said is that stories reach the heart and mind of your audience. When they actually dissected his talk, what they found is 65% of his talk was story-based. He talked about his grandmother and a story from his childhood. He talked about a conversation he had with Rosa Parks, and he talked about the people whom he served. This idea of storytelling is at the heart, just like Muhammad Yunus, is at the heart of how we help people to see our vision and connect to it in an emotional way. Really, it's how we've passed information on from generation to generation. And stories take place in conference rooms today. I think sometimes people are blessed naturally at being good storytellers. And for the rest of us, it's a skill we need to learn if we want to be effective communicators inside organizations. Stories, they convey meaning, generate emotion, inspire action, facts inform. But stories are what move people. They turn complexity into clarity. And they're the only things we remember as humans. You know, if we think about the things that stick with us, quite often they're tied to a story, a bigger story for us, or a story that someone has told us. One of my colleagues just shared this with me, and I loved it. And if you look at pile of Legos, you know, children's Legos, and if you kind of look at this pile, it's like, yep, that's data. There are your facts right there. Well, what if I sort the data? Okay, here's what it looks like. That's data sorted. Well, what if I kind of arrange it? You know, that's what it looks like. That's the data arranged or the facts arranged. What if I presented it visually? Here's what it looks like. Well, here's what it looks like. That same Legos when they're explained with a story. Like we turn that complexity of that data into something that people remember, even that presented visually. Well, that's great. But if you tell me a story about it, I'm going to remember it because I have it pictured in my brain and I'll start to be able to recall that. So again, I believe some people are blessed naturally great storytellers and some, again, learn skill. So what makes a great story? Our belief is two things make a great story. The first is telling the right story. We don't tell stories to entertain. We tell stories to move people, to influence people. So it's picking the story that really has an end goal of what we're looking to accomplish. And what else makes a great story is telling the story right. Again, some people it comes naturally, some people it's learning the skill. So when you're looking to tell a story, if you're looking to influence someone, know what your purpose of the story is. So Muhammad Yunus, the purpose of his story was to generate commitment to the microcredit industry. It was to facilitate change for those families in Bangladesh during the height of the famine. And he chose Sophia's story so that he could help to generate commitment and facilitate change. Brian Stevenson in his TED Talk, his story was to educate and it was to facilitate change. and to generate, again, I think it was to illustrate culture, how it currently is, and to facilitate change in how we see things in the justice system. A couple of thoughts on how do I craft a story? So how do I tell the story right? Three things help us to become better storytellers. And they all begin with a C. The first is character. It's making sure there are people in our stories and we've named them. So Muhammad Yunus was really clear. He told Sophia's story because we can actually picture what Sophia looks like. Brian Stevenson talked about his grandmother. I don't know what his grandmother looks like, but I pictured her. And I still have a picture of what she looks like as he was telling the story. So it's having people name them in your story, making sure there's dialogue in your story, because that helps to cement the story in people's brains and so that they can recall, okay, his grandmother, here's what his grandmother said, here's what he said back. I think the third C, critically important, is this idea of color. So it's providing just enough detail that people remember, but not so much detail that they start to glaze over. So in Muhammad Yunus's story, the story was how many US dollars did he have to pull out of his pocket? My guess is many of you remembered how many US dollars. I had $27. Just enough data that people remember the relevant facts, but don't overdo it, that people start to glaze over. So oftentimes people ask, well, how many stories do I need to have? How do I find stories? And one of our colleagues who wrote a book on leadership communication used to say, like, leaders should have 20 stories, mined and polished. And he would say, not that they're going to tell 20 stories, but once you've chosen or picked 20 stories and you've polished them and you've practiced them and you've gotten feedback on them, you might not ever tell them again, but it makes you a good storyteller. We become better storytellers, better communicators when we practice and get feedback. So where do I find stories? The best stories, as you can imagine, are stories you've experienced. So it's pulling them from your experience, being mindful not to tell war stories or hero stories. You want to be thoughtful about, am I making other people a hero? Am I serving others? Second best stories about those you know. Again, told within good nature, of course. Again, based on your experience, but about those you know. Third best stories are any other stories. The group I was with this week, yeah, third best stories, like go to Google. So it's finding a story that matches what's the purpose of your story, who's your audience, and practicing it, and again, polishing that story to be able to tell it. How do I, other places that I can find stories: book, movie, current event, a defeat, a success, first boss, last boss, first job, last job, best, worst, etc. Sometimes we can be thoughtful about stories by looking at some classic story themes. Okay, am I looking for kind of a Phoenix Rising story, and use that as our starting point to finding a story that might be relevant to whatever we're trying to do in terms of getting things done. So again, 4 key ideas for getting your voice heard in this really noisy organization. Foundation of trust, that's around my authenticity. Do people know what I stand for? Am I consistent to that? Do I do what I say I'm going to do? Do I live that every day? Personal connection, connecting with what's most important to us. Am I passionate about what I'm delivering it? Can I connect with it personally in some way? How do I get in the other person's shoes? What's most important to them? And how do I also connect it to what's important to the organization? Content is crucial. We talked about facts. The facts might not be boring. You may be. Find a way to present the facts in a way that people can enjoy and remember. We looked at imagery. This isn't about carrying pictures around. It is about helping people visualize what it is you're looking to communicate. And the last was around language. What language are you using, or what language carries power inside the organization or with the individuals you're communicating? And the last piece is around story. Am I able to help people see a bigger story for themselves? Am I able to connect what it is I'm looking to communicate in a story in some way? I'd like to end with a story about this gentleman. My guess is many of you know who this is, James Earl Jones. And I oftentimes will say, well, what's James Earl Jones known for? And people say, well, Mufasa and Field of Dreams, and This Is CNN, and Darth Vader. He's known for that big baritone voice. In his autobiography, he shared a story about his childhood. And he said that he had a speech impediment when he was young. He had a bit of a stutter. And when his family moved, his stutter became more pronounced. So much so that the other children made fun of him. So he stopped talking. And he did not, and especially in school, he didn't speak a whole lot because the kids made fun of him. So he shut down. So fast forward, he's now in high school. His voice has changed. He now has the James Earl Jones voice. And his English teacher assigned an assignment. He had to write a poem. So he wrote the poem, he handed it in, and the teacher said, "This is a great poem. Where'd you copy it from?" And he said he really liked his teacher and he kind of knew what his teacher was getting at. And he said, no, I wrote it. And he said, well, if you wrote it, then you'll have no problem getting up in front of the room and reciting it. So think about it. These children really had never heard him speak in many, many years. And he got up in front of he said he got up in front of the classroom and he read the poem without one stutter. And he said this, and I'd like to end by sharing this with you. He said, make sure the words are yours. Push them from the bottom of your soul, and the performance will take care of itself. I think so often when we're communicating, we're presenting, we worry so much about our performance. Instead, I believe if we make the words our own, we practice them, we make sure they're in our bones, and we reconnect with them in some way, the performance takes care of itself. We're able to connect with others, and we're able to get our voices heard even above really noisy organizations. Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for tuning in. If there's anything that I can do to be helpful, if there's anything we can be helpful as an organization, please reach out. I'm going to hand it back to Hannah. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.